Google Classroom lets me get back on and start posting again. So maybe by tomorrow morning, the video recording of class will be going up. All right, so kind of like I was saying earlier, up until now, we've been looking at really big picture ideas of things, how different organisms are interacting, whether they're helping each other or hurting each other or eating each other. We've been talking about ecosystems and how they change over time, whether it's primary succession starting off on like the bare flat rock, or a secondary succession coming back after like a forest fire or a hurricane or something like that. Today, we're going to switch gears a little bit and focus way down into what exactly are we getting out of the things that we are eating. So when the food web is going on and the snakes are eating the mice and the mice are eating the grass and the hawks are eating the snake, what type of nutrients are they getting? What type of major kind of biological molecules are those organisms consuming? So we call those things macromolecules, which is going to be kind of the main focus of the notes for today. All right, so we're starting to get into a little bit of kind of biology and chemistry mixing together because we're dealing with organic compounds. So in science, whenever you see the word organic, that doesn't mean like it means in the grocery store, like no pesticides or no GMOs or no this or that. All it means is that it has a large amount of carbon. Pretty much all of the life that scientists have studied on Earth so far is based around carbon. And so they call molecules that have a lot of carbon in them organic molecules. So macromolecules is essentially, it just means big molecules. Macro means like big or large. So the macromolecules that we're going to be talking about today are large organic molecules. So they're big molecules with lots of pieces in them, and they're made out of a lot of carbon. So all the other parts of our bodies, like our cells and our tissues and our organs, they're all built out of these macromolecules. They're like the starting point for any type of living thing. So today, in a little bit, there's 4 major ones that we are going to cover before this day is through. We're going to be talking about carbohydrates. We're going to be talking about lipids. We're going to be talking about proteins and about nucleic acids. So some of these you may have heard before. Some of them you may have not, but we're going to cover all of them by the end of today. So before we get there, though, there's a couple kind of basic ideas about macromolecules that we have to cover first. And the first idea is the distinction between monomers and polymers. So these macromolecules, these big organic carbon molecules, are actually built out of lots of repeating pieces, lots of like small copied pieces. And we call those all pieces monomers. So when we put a whole bunch of monomers together, so mono means like one or singular. It's kind of like uno in Spanish is one. Mono in, I think it's probably like Latin or Greek, means like one or singular. Poly means like many or multiple. So polymers are when we put lots of monomers all together. So it looks kind of like this. We have these little individual monomers right here, these little yellow pieces. And then if we link a whole bunch of those pieces together, it's called a polymer. So lots of little pieces. These are all, for the most part, the same or similar. And then we stick lots of them all together in order to create these polymers. So the individual little pieces, the building blocks, are called monomers. And the larger full structures are polymers. So the monomer is like the single one basic unit. And then the polymer is like lots of pieces. So again, poly means like many or a lot. So many pieces go into a polymer, and those pieces are called monomers. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about monomers today. They're an important part of the macromolecules that we're going to go over. So the next thing that we have to talk about is how are macromolecules formed? How do we take all of these little individual monomers and what actually happens when we stick them together in order to make polymers? So it's actually a fairly simple process with a kind of complicated science-y sounding name. So we call it dehydration synthesis. So synthesis is a fancy science word that means like building or making something. And dehydration is just like it says it is. It means losing water or lacking water. So building things by losing water is what's happening in this process. So we have our monomers, and we essentially remove a water molecule from them, and it turns them into polymers. So how that works is we have this polymer chain that we're building. So we have two pieces connected already, and oh, here we have a third piece coming along that wants to join up. So most monomers have an area of them where there is like a little OH group. So there's like an oxygen and a hydrogen atom together. And then off the polymer group, there's usually an area with some hydrogens all together. So if we take off two hydrogens and one oxygen, those will combine into an H2O molecule, also known as water. So when we take that stuff away, now this monomer and this polymer are suddenly left without having things that they're bonded to, so they bond to each other. So we take away a water molecule, and it causes the monomer and polymer to bond together, to come and stick to each other, instead of sticking to these kind of individual little atoms right here. So we take off an H from over here and an OH from over here. That's two H's and one O, so that becomes a water molecule that then goes off to do something else. And the monomer and the polymer get stuck together. Dehydration synthesis, building something by removing water. What about if we want to do the opposite process? What if we want to break those macromolecules apart? So you see this a lot in digestion. So when you eat something, that's a whole bunch of big macromolecules all together. And then we want to break those things down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces in order to absorb those nutrients into our cells. So the way that that happens is basically through the opposite process, which is called hydrolysis. So again, hydro is like water, and then lysis is a fancy science term for like breaking or killing or destroying something. So hydrolysis, breaking things using water. And so this is like literally if we took that other process and ran it in reverse. Now we have this big polymer down here, but we want to break it up into pieces. We want to separate out this little monomer at the end. So we use an H2O molecule, a water molecule, and we basically force it in between the little bond that's holding these together. The polymer bonds to one of the H's. The monomer bonds to an O and an H, and they become separated. They're no longer bonded to each other. So we had a big polymer, and we broke it down into smaller pieces using a water molecule, adding water, hydrolysis. So when we want to build up our macromolecules, build up our structures, we take away a water to make the pieces stick together. And then when we want to break down our structures and separate them apart, we add water, which causes them to unstick from each other. So you don't have to know like the super specifics of what exactly is going on between all the bonds down here. The main thing to remember is that dehydration synthesis is when we take out this water molecule and it causes the structure to get bigger. And hydrolysis is when we add this water molecule and it causes the structure to get smaller. All right. So before we get into the actual macromolecules themselves, does anybody have any questions so far on the monomers, the polymers, the building, the breaking, anything that I've talked about so far? Any questions?
Yes, can you hear me, Mr. Michael?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I just want to ask you about the HO, the first one. So this is hydroxygen or?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay. So hydroxygens and this part.
So there's, an oxygen and a hydrogen that are together. And then we pull that off of this guy. And we pull a hydrogen off of this guy. That H and this O become a water molecule together. And then the monomer and polymer bond together. They stick together after that H2O leaves.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great question. All right. So the next thing that we're going to go over is the major kind of facets of those 4 macromolecules that I talked about earlier. And so the main thing that you need to know and kind of pay attention with these things are the names of the 4 macromolecules themselves. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. The name of the monomer for each one. So each one of these macromolecules is going to have its own monomer, its own building block that we'll talk about. You should know a little bit about what they're used for. So what's kind of the main purpose of these macromolecules? Then finally, major food sources. So what types of foods will you most likely find these in? And the reason that you need to know these things is A, it's important for this class and the STAR test. But B, it also is what your homework is going to be based on. So I know that a lot of you might be having problems with it now if the Google Classroom is still acting up. But the homework basically looks like this. Unfortunately, I'm not really able to make this into a Google form version, so everybody will have to do it on the Google Doc version. But for each one of our macromolecule, our carbohydrates, our lipids, our proteins, our nucleic acids. You have to fill in these 3 sets of boxes. So for each one, you have to tell me what's the name of its monomer, what are its major functions in the body, and what types of food do they come in. So I'll make sure to really hit those points home when we go over each one. But if you're not able to look at the chart and follow along as we're going through the notes, that's the basic information that you'll need to go back and fill in later for each one of the 4 types of macromolecule. Okay, let's see here. All right, so I personally like to start off with one of the best ones, in my opinion, and one of my favorite, possibly my very favorite type of macromolecule is carbohydrates. You've probably heard of these before, like people try to go on low carb diets, or they're worried about the amount of carbohydrates in their food, or they're trying to reduce their carb intake. These carbohydrates are the main thing that they are talking about. There we go. So the monomer of carbohydrates, the basic unit of these carbs, are these little carbon rings called simple sugars, or if you want to use the fancy science word, you can call them monosaccharides, meaning like one sugar, essentially. So glucose is probably the most common carbohydrate that people study. And you can see it's this little kind of ring-shaped structure of mostly carbons with a little oxygen thrown in there and some branching off oxygens and carbons as well. So one single ring on its own is called a simple sugar or a monosaccharide. But we can take lots and lots of these rings and stick them together into our carbohydrates, into our polysaccharides. So you can see we've still got all of these rings, but now instead of just having one ring on its own, we have 4 rings that are stuck together. And sometimes you can get tons and tons of rings of these simple sugars all together in these big complex carbohydrates. So you'll see sometimes things referred to as simple carbs or complex carbs. Simple carbs are usually things that are 1 or 2 or 3 rings long, whereas complex carbohydrates are much, much longer in general. So we have our basic simple sugar, our monosaccharide, and we can combine lots and lots and lots of those together to make our big carbohydrate structure, our big polysaccharide. So the main reason why it's important to not completely cut carbs out of your diet, and the reason why we need carbohydrates, is because carbohydrates are our main energy source for our body. These are the main way that your body creates energy, is by breaking down carbohydrates. So depending on the type of carbohydrates that you're eating depends on the kind of energy that you get. Things like candy and soda and things with a lot of sugar in them. The sugars that are in those things, like glucose or corn syrup, are usually very short, small rings. And so you're able to digest them very quickly. You get that burst of energy, you know, like that sugar rush. But then it all runs out very quickly and you have that crash at the end. Longer chains, more complex carbohydrates, take a longer time to break down, so they provide kind of more slow and steady energy. over time. So the main way that these carbs are broken down is you start off with a really big piece, and then that gets broken down into smaller chunks of like 2 or 3 simple sugars together. And then those will be broken down and completely separated out. Now, whenever these rings get completely broken down inside of your cells, that is what gives you the energy that you need. So carbohydrates are super useful. They are where pretty much almost all of the energy in our body comes from. So we can't always eat all the different types of carbohydrates that are out there. Things with a lot of cellulose in them. So cellulose is a plant-based carbohydrate. It's a very structural carb, so there's a lot of it in like leaves and grass and stuff like that. That's why if you ever for whatever reason tried to survive on just like leaves and grass, you would have a really bad time because our body isn't able to break down those types of carbs. We can't break down cellulose. It goes right through your body without providing you any energy or nutrition or stuff like that. So, but most of the stuff that we eat that has carbohydrates in them, we break it down in our cells and we get the energy from it. So sweet things are what have most of our simple carbs. So obviously there's artificial sweeteners and artificial sugar that goes into candy and fruit juice and soda and stuff like that. But we can also get them from things like fruit and vegetables and milk. They also have a lot of natural, simple carbohydrates. If we want something more complex, we turn to one of my personal favorite food groups, and that would be things like pasta and bread, potatoes, starchy things like that. So these things are broken down more slowly in your cells, and they provide a larger amount of energy over a long period of time. So simple carbs give us quick energy. Complex carbs like starches and bread provide more energy over kind of a longer period of time. Now, the reason why people, when they're dieting, try to cut down on their carbs is because it's easy. If you eat a lot of carbs in the day, your body takes all of that or notices it has a ton of extra energy, and it stores that energy as fat. And so when you're eating, when you have an overabundance of energy in your body, it'll get stored up because your body doesn't want to waste it. So it'll store up all that extra energy, maybe in a way that you would rather it not. So as much as I love pasta and bread, unfortunately, I know that I probably should not eat it for every meal of the day as much as I would like to, because it's not a great nutritional strategy for you. So carbohydrates, simple sugars that get built into those big complex carbs, we use them for energy in our body, either short bursts of energy or long sustained energy. And we get them from all sorts of food places like sugar and fruits and vegetables, as well as things like pasta and bread and starches like potatoes. All right. Anybody have any questions about carbohydrate macromolecules before we move on? All righty. Moving on to the next one. So the next macromolecule that we're going to go over are called lipids. And while you might not recognize the name of lipids at first, I was actually just talking about these in a way that you maybe did not realize, because lipids are another way of saying fat. So a lipid, the monomer, the basic unit of a lipid, is this big long chain called a fatty acid. So a fatty acid is our building block of lipids. It looks like this. It has some C's and O's on one end, but then it's just a big long chain of C's and H's. So again, it's an organic molecule because it is mostly made out of carbon. Our fatty acids, one of them on their own is a fatty acid, a monomer. Well, we can take 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 or 18 of these fatty acids and put them together to create lipids. So usually they're connected by these carbon groups here at the very edge. And so we'll stick a bunch of those together, and then the chains themselves will kind of come off along the side. So there are different forms that these lipids can take, but the main thing to remember about them is these really long carbon chains that are called fatty acids. So when you think of lipids or when you see lipids, I want you to think fat. So there are a couple different things that lipids are especially useful for in our body. We'll talk about the ones that you're probably more familiar with in a second, but the one that you might not be as familiar with, but is absolutely crucial and essential for your body, is that lipids are what make up the cell membrane of every single cell in your body. So I'll talk about what exactly cell membranes are a little bit later in the term. It's essentially like the covering of a cell. It's like the boundary of where one cell ends and the next one starts. That is the cell membrane. And every single cell membrane in our body is made out of hundreds and hundreds of lipids. The main thing that we probably think of lipids as being used for is these guys are our long-term energy storage. So like I was saying earlier, if you eat a whole bunch of carbohydrates and your body has too many, then it'll convert the energy from those carbohydrates and use that to build lipids, to build fat. So that later on, if maybe you're starting to run a little bit of a deficit of carbohydrates, you're not quite taking in enough energy, it can burn this fat in order to get that energy back. So it's not as quick and simple a process of breaking down carbohydrates, but it is a way that your body makes sure to hang on to extra energy. Because we put all that energy into finding the food and cooking the food and eating that food, and your body doesn't want any of that to go to waste. It's going to store all the extra energy that it can. So that's where lipids especially come in handy. They also are really good at insulating our bodies. So we have a really thin layer of lipids kind of right underneath your skin, and that's what helps keep the interior temperatures of your body warm. If you ever taken your temperature, which I'm guessing you probably have a lot these days, especially going places, they take your temperature before you go in to make sure that you don't have COVID. Your body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Usually that is a lot higher than the surrounding temperature. Maybe some days in the summer in Texas, it gets up that high or hotter. But for the most part, on days like today, it's way cooler outside than it is inside of our body. But we got to keep all that heat inside. We don't want it escaping to the outside. We need that body heat. So that thin layer of lipids helps us to keep warm and help keeps that body heat in. And certain animals that live in like the Arctic or Antarctic, they have a really thick layer of fat underneath their skin. And those animals, it's usually called blubber, which is just a fun word to say in general. But that blubber helps to keep things like Arctic seals and whales and penguins and polar bears warm, right? It's literally freezing in the Arctic and Antarctic, but these animals live there and they have to stay warm. And they do that by having that really thick fat layer that helps them maintain their inner body temperature. Oh, so here, I think this one was supposed to come up with the first point here. So here's like kind of a typical cell in your body where you have some stuff going on the inside of the cell and you have stuff on the outside of the cell. And there's lipids, this bilayer, which is just a fancy way of saying there's two layers of lipids, one along the top here and one along the bottom. These lipids are what make up that cell membrane and make sure to keep all the inside stuff inside and the outside stuff out. It's kind of like the walls of your house or of your car. You want to keep the heat and the cool inside and the rain and the snow outside. For our cells, that's what the lipids do. They prevent things from getting inside the cell that aren't supposed to be there. All right, and like I said, every single cell, all of the billions and billions of cells in your body are covered by this lipid layer right here. All right, so lipids made out of fatty acids protect our cells, keep us warm, and is useful for energy storage, for storing fat that we can burn as energy later. So, where do we get lipids from in our diets? What kind of food will give us lots of nice lipids for our cells? Well, as you might imagine, if lipids are what's used to create fat, fatty foods contain a lot of lipids. So things like red meat, especially, so a lot of beef or pork or bacon has a good amount of lipids in it. Fish as well, especially things like salmon or tuna that are on the fatty end of fish have a good amount of lipids. Oils, things like vegetable oil or olive oil, is basically just liquefied lipids. Same thing with like butter is essentially like solidified lipids. Avocados, for a fruit, they're one of the few fruits that has a good amount of fat in them. Not necessarily meaning a bad thing, like we were just talking about. We need lipids for our cells. And then also eggs have some lipids in them, and also certain nuts are pretty lipid rich as well. So when you think like greasy, fatty, oily food, that means that it's probably got a whole bunch of lipids in it. Because either it's something that's made out of like ground beef or a steak or bacon or something like that, or it was cooked in a lot of oil. So the lipids transferred from the oil to the food that you're eating. That's part of the reasons why it tastes so good. Our body loves it when we eat lipids. All right. So that is our second macromolecule that we're going to talk about today. Anybody have any lipid questions or any carbohydrate questions before we keep moving on? All right, so we've talked about carbohydrates, which we use for energy. We've talked about lipids, which we sometimes use for energy, but also use for lots of other things. The next one that we're going to go over is a little bit less of things we use for energy, and instead it has to do with small structures that are really important for kind of doing lots of different jobs in our cells. And those would be proteins. So I'm assuming everybody's heard of protein before. You've probably heard it, especially if you know anybody in your family that's like super athletic or likes to work out. a whole lot. They're constantly looking to like up their protein intake or keep on top of their protein. And there's a reason for that, that we'll get into a little bit later, actually. But proteins are not just going straight like into your muscles and stuff. They're actually really, really important macromolecules for your body. So proteins are made up of lots and lots and lots of small monomers called amino acids. So we had our fatty acids for lipids, and now we have our amino acids for proteins. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of amino acids. You don't have to know all the different ones that are out there. You just have to know that we take lots and lots and lots, dozens or even hundreds of amino acids and combine them together in order to create proteins. So this is the basic structure of an amino acid. It's a carbon with some COs on one side and some NHs on another side. And then this R group is where they are different. So every one of the 20 different amino acids has a different structure on this kind of R group area. Again, you don't really have to know what they are. Just know that there's different amino acids that are out there. So when we take these amino acids and string a whole bunch of them together, we form a protein. So just like we connect a bunch of simple sugars to make a carbohydrate or a whole bunch of fatty acids to make a lipid, we connect a lot of amino acids in order to create a protein. So what the different kinds of amino acids that get connected together gives us different kinds of proteins. And there are hundreds and hundreds of different proteins in the human body that all do different things. So here are all the different amino acids that are out there. Like I said, there's 20 of them. You guys don't really have to know anything about them specifically, unless someday you are like Mr. Stanley and you have to take a biochemistry course in college, which means that you have to memorize every single one of the structures for every single one of the 20 proteins. So at some point in my lifetime, you could tell me the name of a protein and I could draw you the structure of what exactly, how many carbons it had and where they were attached, if they formed a ring or if there was some nitrogens or some sulfurs in there. I had to learn all of these things at one point. They all pretty much immediately left my brain after that test. But luckily, you guys will probably never have to do that unless you go hardcore into some biology or biochemistry in college. The main takeaway is just that there are a whole bunch of different amino acids, and we can combine them together in different ways to create proteins. So proteins are super complex in how they are formed. We have this long string of amino acids, but after they all get put together, it gets curved and twisted and formed into different shapes. But the main thing to know about all that curving and twisting is that the shape of a protein determines its function. So how a protein is formed is incredibly important. Depending on what sorts of folds and what sorts of shapes that protein has, it'll be able to do different jobs depending on those shapes. Conversely, if a protein gets misfolded or misshaped while it's being created, then it essentially is totally broken. It can't really be used for anything. So it's extremely important that cells get this protein shape correct when they're making it. Because if the shape of the protein is right, then it'll be able to do its job perfectly. If the shape of the protein is off, even just a little bit, then it basically becomes completely unable to be used or do anything. So really, really important to know that the function of the protein and the shape of the protein go hand in hand. What a protein looks like can tell us what kind of job that it plays in the cell. So what jobs are out there for proteins? Like I said, there are hundreds of different things that proteins do, but we're only going to focus on a couple big ones for this class. One of the most important things that they do is they build and repair muscle tissue. So this is the reason why people who are like super into fitness and super into building up their muscles and getting really big muscles are looking like drink a lot of protein shakes and are eating a very high protein diet, because when you work out, you cause a little bit of damage to your muscles. That proteins then come in and they fix the damage and they add on extra muscle tissue in order to help that damage from being created again. And that's what causes muscles to build up and grow bigger over time, is because of that constant breaking and then building and then breaking and then building. So the more protein that you have there, the faster your muscles will be able to be fixed, and the more protein that you'll be able to pack into your muscles. So that's why things like protein shakes and protein powders have gotten so popular in the last 10 to 20 years, is because people who got really into fitness realized that if they could take in a whole bunch of protein without having to eat a ton of like calories, then they could help out their muscles. So helping out your muscles and tissues is a really big aspect of proteins. Another one are enzymes. So actually, we're going to talk a whole bunch about enzymes next week in more detail. But the main basic functions of enzymes is that they speed up chemical reactions. So like the hydrolysis reaction we were talking about earlier, where we break a polymer into monomer pieces, a lot of times that happens due to an enzyme. Enzymes are these special proteins that fit on to a particular substance, cause the chemical reaction to happen really rapidly, and then release the new products that have been created. So in the case of hydrolysis, our substance starts off as one big piece, but then the enzyme breaks it down into two smaller pieces. And thanks to the enzyme, this happened much, much, much faster and more efficiently than if we just kind of let this happen naturally without any input. So enzymes are a type of protein, and they are essential for keeping our bodies running at a healthy speed, kind of at our normal speed. So we need enzymes in order to make sure that all the chemical reactions that power our body all happen correctly and efficiently. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to get protein in your diet besides just eating protein powder and drinking protein shakes. Obviously, meat has a lot of protein in it because most of the meat that we eat is muscles from the animal. And we just talked about muscles have a whole bunch of protein going into them. So meat and fish. Legumes, so things like peanuts also are a good source of protein, as well as milk and eggs. So that's why they really suggest like little kids drink a lot of milk. It's not just for the calcium, it's also for the protein that they're getting to help build their muscles. And then some grains and soy products also have protein in them. One of the cool things, or kind of one of the interesting things about eating protein in your diet, is that earlier I mentioned that there are 20 total amino acids. For the most part, we can make a lot of the amino acids that we need. So even if we didn't eat anything, we'd be able to make about 14 of those 20. But there are 6 that we cannot make. Our body does not have the machinery in order to build these 6 particular amino acids. So the only way we get them into our diet is by eating other food that has them in there. So we need to eat protein-rich foods so that we can break down those proteins and get those amino acids and kind of use them for our own uses. So proteins, they're made out of amino acids. They have really important shapes and structures that determine what they do. And they can do all sorts of things, from building muscle tissue, repairing damaged muscles, to being enzymes that help chemical reactions occur very quickly. And we can get proteins from all sorts of different sources, like meat, eggs, milk, and grains. All right. Does anybody have any protein-related questions? Anything about proteins you wanted me to go back and talk about a little more? All righty. Does not sound like it. So we've gone over carbohydrates. We've gone over lipids. We've talked about proteins. So the one final macromolecule that you may have heard a little bit about before, but maybe not in this specific way, are nucleic acids. So nucleic acids might not sound familiar to you at first, but if you've ever heard about DNA before, DNA is a type of nucleic acid. The Na in DNA stands for nucleic acid. So the monomer, the building block of a nucleic acid, is called a nucleotide. So pretty easy to remember in terms of the nucleotide goes with the nucleic acid. Oops. So a single nucleotide looks like this. They all have a phosphate group. They all have a sugar group. And they all have one of 4 different bases. So kind of like how there was 20 different amino acids, there are 4 different main nucleotides. So this is the part on them that looks a little bit different. So if we take a bunch of nucleotides, like thousands or millions of them, and put them together, then we can form things like DNA, which is double-stranded. So it's 2 strands of nucleotides that are kind of swirling around one another. There's also a type called RNA, which is a single-stranded nucleotide, or nucleic acid, excuse me. So the polymer is this nucleic acid, which is what the Na in DNA or RNA stands for. And it's made up of thousands or millions of these little nucleotides. So if you've heard of, like with the coronavirus, the vaccine that they started rolling out, you might hear the news, or some people call it an mRNA-based vaccine. That RNA is a nucleic acid. So that's a specific type of nucleic acid that they are using in order to create these vaccines for the coronavirus. So nucleic acids have a very basic but incredibly important function in our bodies. They are what store and carry our genetic information. So all of the genes that make you you, that determine things like your height and your eye color and your nose shape and how much you look like your dad and how much you look like your mom, how you taste different things, how you smell different things. All of that genetic information is stored in your DNA. And so we might talk about DNA a little bit at the end of this term, but especially if you ever take Biology B here at the Excel Center, one of the first things that you'll talk about is DNA and how exactly it carries that information. For right now, you don't need to know exactly how DNA stores that information. You just need to know that it does. That's what it's there for. So every single cell in your body has a complete set of DNA that determines basically everything about how your body runs. So like the proteins that we were talking about a second ago, I mentioned that there's hundreds of different proteins and they all do different jobs in your body. The instructions to make all those proteins are inside of your DNA. So all of those little nucleotides are set up in a way to carry the information needed to make those proteins. So half of your genetic information you inherit from your mom, half of it you inherit from your dad. And then when you have kids, you pass on half of your genetic information to your kids. So it keeps getting passed down generation to generation to generation. And it's all stored in those nucleotides and nucleic acids. So like I was saying, every single cell in your body has DNA in it. Every single cell in the body of all animals and plants on this planet has DNA inside of it. So we get all sorts of the components to make the nucleic acids, the sugars, the phosphates, and those bases from basically most of the different types of food in our diet. So any food that's based mainly on plant or animal products is going to have nucleic acids in it. So this does not mean junk food or things that humans have like created, like snack food and stuff like that. That probably isn't really so much. If it's mostly built out of salt and sugar, then probably not that many nucleic acids. But most food, most whole food, like fruits and veggies and grains and meat, is going to have a good amount of nucleic acid in it. And then we can use that nucleic acid to build our own RNA and DNA. All right, so I have one little section of stuff that I want to go over with you guys before we finish up here. But before we do that, does anybody have any nucleic acid questions, any DNA or nucleotide related questions they want me to go back and go over? Alrighty, doesn't sound like it. Sounds like everybody is okay with this stuff so far. So the last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was just give a little bit of sort of the overview of the process of how do we take the macromolecules that are in our food and break them down and then turn them into human macromolecules. Because obviously, a head of broccoli or a piece of steak or a scoop of potatoes is not going to have human macromolecules in there, right? It's going to have broccoli macromolecules or cow macromolecules or potato macromolecules. So we need to turn those into human macromolecules. That's the entire reason that we're eating this food in the first place. So when we eat these macromolecules that come from these other food sources, as they go through your digestive system, as they go through your stomach and intestines, they are digested and broken down into their monomers. So we're taking apart these big macromolecules piece by piece by piece. And that's kind of what the process of digestion is all about. It's kind of like if you bought some land and there was this old brick building sitting on it, And the bricks looked nice, like they were really pretty and really well kept. But the building was kind of collapsing and it was really dangerous and nobody should really live in there. And you're like, all right, well, I'm going to take all these bricks and save them, but I'm going to demolish the building itself, completely get rid of it down to the foundation. We're going to start from scratch. So those monomers, those individual building blocks, those bricks, if you will, are then absorbed into your bloodstream and sent all around your body in your blood, and they'll end up in the cells of your body, whether that's a skin cell or a muscle cell or a heart cell or a stomach cell or a lung cell. Your cells are fed by your blood, and so they'll get those monomers that came from your digestive system. So your cells aren't really getting lipids or carbohydrates or nucleic acids right off the bat. They're getting fatty acids, they're getting amino acids, they're getting nucleotides sent to them. Inside of those cells, that's where we take those little pieces, those little monomers, and then build them back up into our human macromolecules, the macromolecules that we actually need in order to keep living. So we build our own proteins, we build our own DNA, we build our own carbohydrates, our own lipids that we need. So it's like if you took apart that building, took out all of the wood and the wiring and stripped everything down to the foundation, but you kept those nice bricks. And then you went back and you used those exact same bricks, but you built up a really nice house to live in. A safe structure, it has all the rooms and stuff that you want. And you did it by recycling all of the old bricks that you tore out of the old building. Similar thing happening here with creating our own macromolecules out of the pieces that we broke down from our food. Because again, the macromolecules in a steak, the macromolecules in some green beans or in some tuna aren't going to be really the ones that we need directly. We eat them because we want to get to those monomers. We want to get to those building blocks. So again, we can take carbohydrates and we break them down into simple sugars and send them into our cells to be further developed into energy. We take lipids and break them down into fatty acids, which we then send to our cells and use to create new cell membranes or to store as long-term energy as fat. We take proteins and break them down into amino acid, which our cells can then use to turn into human proteins. And we take nucleic acids that we break down from the plants and animals that we eat. Those nucleotides get sent to our cells, and then our cells can use them to build new DNA, because when a cell divides, it basically copies itself, and then that includes copying the DNA. So we need these extra nucleotides so that we can build new copies of our human DNA. Again, it came in as cow DNA or potato DNA or broccoli DNA, but we broke it down into those pieces and rebuilt those pieces into human DNA. All right, and that brings us to the end of our macromolecules. Again, I haven't checked the Google Classroom recently because I've been here with you guys. So I don't know if it's 100% fixed yet, but if it is not, and you have to wait till later to work on this chart, that is okay.
It's still glitching a bit, but
all right.
It's,
good.
Yeah, it's working now.
And so I'd say try maybe 1 or 2 times later tonight if you're still going to be up. But if it's not working, again, since you guys are all here for class tonight, then you all got your Thursday attendance credit checked off. So when you are ready to go back, or when Google Classroom allows you to go back and turn in the assignment obviously those notes have been posted for a little while, so feel free to go back to the notes or back to this video if that helps you a little bit more. But for the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acid, I just want you to make a little note. You don't have to draw it, Estrella. You can just write down the name of the monomer. So what is the monomer called for carbohydrates? What's it called for lipids, for proteins, for nucleic acids, stuff like that?
And I have a question, Mr. Michael.
Yes.
What is this, the ratio, like, what are we gonna need for it?
The ratio, so I borrowed this chart from one of the old teachers who really like to go into the different types of atoms that are on these macromolecules. So it's saying that there's about twice as many H's as C's and O's in carbohydrates, and then same for lipids and proteins. I'm not really interested in you guys knowing it down to that level. It's kind of like there if you want it. And I can't remember. This might be an older version of the chart. So on the new chart, I can't remember if I left this in there or not. If it is, then you can essentially just ignore it if you want. It's not really something we're going to go deep into in this class. It's just kind of showing how many of each atom are in these different types of macromolecules. So good question, but you don't really have to look at it or worry about it for my class. You just have to focus on what is the monomer of this macromolecule called, what are some of the functions that it does in the body, and then what are some of the kind of major food groups where you can get a large amount of this macromolecule. And again, unfortunately, since it is in this big kind of chart form, I'm not able to really convert it into a Google form that I know that a lot of people like. So you'll be stuck with just filling out the little squares on the Google Doc for the assignment.
So for the carbohydrates, the monomer would be like the simple sugars?
Bingo.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. All right, good questions so far. Any other questions about the macromolecules themselves, or the breaking and building processes, or the chart that you're going to do for your homework, either today or this weekend, who knows? Any final questions before we wrap it up here this evening?
No, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Okay. All right. Here we go. So as always, if you do have any more questions, or if you're still struggling with Google Classroom during the day tomorrow or over the weekend, please reach out to me. You can send me a text. You can send me an email. You can leave a comment. If it's working, you can leave a comment on the Google Classroom, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I see your message and am able to respond.